Hi, I'm Bill Gaines, host of the Outdoor View, the place where we educate, connect, and learn to protect our outdoor traditions. And today I have the pleasure of having with me Dr. Brandon Munk, who's a veterinarian with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. How are you doing, Brandon?
I'm well, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, absolute pleasure to have you. And so, what role do you serve with the department?
I'm one of our senior wildlife veterinarians, and I'm the senior veterinarian over game species
Very good. So, when it comes to bears, deer, turkeys, all of those critters, you're the guy, right?
for
Yeah,
health and disease related stuff. Yep.
right, exactly. Well, I live in a rural area, Brandon, so I see more than my fair share of deer, turkeys, occasionally bears. We're at a little bit of a lower elevation, but we're seeing more and more of those as well. I got a lot of neighbors that feed deer, as an example, feed turkeys and so on and so forth. Yeah, I don't, but tell me, is it or is it not illegal to feed wildlife for one?
In California, it is not legal to feed wildlife, and in particular, it's illegal to feed big game species like deer and bear.
Now, there's reasons for that. So, kind of share
There,
with our viewers, why is it legal to feed wildlife?
yeah, there are a lot of good reasons for that. One of them is we don't want hunters taking game over bait piles. So baiting is illegal. But a big part of it is breaking those natural behaviors that deer and that we want deer and bear and really any wild species to be using. We want them to have their natural behaviors, and the more we put food out for them that is not their normal forage, the more likely we are to get them to deviate from those normal behaviors. And once they start deviating from those normal behaviors, a lot of which are set up for survival, right? So biggest part of survival is where do I find food, water, and shelter. Start putting out food, water, or shelter for those animals, and they'll start using it, particularly as our human populations increase and we spread more and more into wild habitats. Um, there's a greater risk for that overlap to occur, and the more we feed, the more likely they are to get outside of those natural behaviors, such as foraging.
Right. And of course, it's an attractant, right, as well. And doesn't it bring up problems when you start getting, high densities of any wild animal that are because of foods being provided and so on and so forth? I imagine that has its own problems, right?
Yeah, it does. As an attractant, you're going to bring animals into habitats that they might not normally spend a lot of time on. You also might end up congregating them, so getting them at higher numbers than they might usually have. And if they stick around for a long period of time, that can really exacerbate some disease issues. And the disease issue and really the health issue is kind of one of the other major reasons why feeding of wildlife is illegal in California. Um, Oftentimes, what we end up feeding them is not their natural forage, and these animals, if you think about a ruminant, like a white-tailed or black-tailed deer or mule deer, or elk, they have a very specialized GI tract that they've evolved to help them break down pretty low value food and turn it into energy and protein and all the things that they need to survive and really thrive. Oftentimes, the food that we put out are high carbohydrate foods, lots of sugars, lots of carbs, kind of, and and a ruminant in particular that really messes up that big fermentation vat, that rumen and the bacteria associated with it. You can actually get diseases just associated with the food that we're giving them, and something like ruminal acidosis, where the the contents in the rumen, the acidic nature of it gets greater and greater, and you can get ulcers. You can get a breakdown of the good bacteria. They can start changing, start going to bad bacteria. You can get other diseases like slipper foot or hoof diseases associated with that. And ultimately, these animals can die just based on food that we're giving them. But also, as you start attracting these animals, you might bring either direct contact or indirect contact that wouldn't naturally happen. So deer being herd animals, direct contact is pretty common. They're gonna travel around in some size of a herd, and you start putting food out, and that might bring multiple herds in an area together on a piece of habitat that they might not normally spend time on. So maybe you have a small herd group or a group of does that are 5 to 10 animals big, and then start putting food out, and then that allows enough food for another group to come in. You might have 20 animals, you might have 30 animals. As that number gets bigger, you have much more contact between individuals, and you have a much greater likelihood of passing disease from one animal to another. Also, some of these diseases that we worry about, like parasites, a lot of the parasite cycle, internal parasite cycles, involve eggs being pooped out and then consumed by another susceptible host to set up that life cycle again. So if you start congregating these animals, you're going to have more feces on the landscape. You're probably going to have more parasites on the landscape, and we think we see this in the foothills, particularly the Sierras, where you get a lot of animals maybe congregating on fairly marginal habitat. End of winter, beginning of spring. Maybe they had a really good winter the previous year, so fawn survival is really high. There might be a lot of young animals out there. There might be a lot of old animals out there, and then you have a marginal winter or a difficult winter, or something changes, and all these animals are congregating on a landscape, and feeding can exacerbate that. And there's just a lot more animals to propagate that parasite life cycle, so you have a greater parasite load. And if you have weak, i.e. young or old animals, more likely to succumb to that parasite load in those situations. And then there's infectious diseases, some of which can be directly transmitted, and usually viruses is what we're thinking about, where you can have a pretty quick transmission and a pretty quick disease turnaround. Certainly there are some of our hemorrhagic disease viruses that would increase transmission and mortality associated with congregating animals. And then again, kind of using the deer example, oftentimes where we might be feeding these animals, it might be an area where you've got livestock as well, or you're putting feed out for your livestock and you start seeing deer around, and you think, oh, well, I can just start feeding the deer too. They're probably hungry as well. Well, it also brings deer and livestock in contact, and then there's some diseases that can go between the two. The viral hemorrhagic diseases like blue tongue, epizootic hemorrhagic disease virus, those two can bounce between deer and our other ruminants. Those are moved around by midges, by biting midges. And so if you've got standing water out or other sources of water that could be a way for these midges to reproduce, start putting these animals together, you start putting that disease vector next to them, and then potentially you have a virus going around, not only just to the deer, but also potentially to your livestock.
Yeah, and a lot of the people that live around me have horses and so on and so forth. So I could definitely see something like that causing some serious problems for sure. Yeah. What you talk about conflicts between wild animals and domestic animals, or diseases transferring from one to the other. What about just human conflict? I mean, I would think if these critters are being fed by humans, they're getting used to humans, they're seeing them, they're getting used to seeing dogs and this and that, everything else. I would think that the human conflict would go through the roof as well because of a lack of fear and just sheer numbers of more wild animals, coming close, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And most of us want to see wildlife. We enjoy seeing wildlife. It's part of what we like about California, or maybe part of what we like about living in semi-rural or rural areas. The hard thing to remember is that a habituated wild animal, the odds of it dying because of some human caused factor um, really start increasing significantly the more habituated they get.
Mhm.
So whether it's a hit by car, if you're in a neighborhood, and there's areas in Sacramento and the surrounding areas where there's a lot of resident deer, and they just really don't have much fear of people, so they're walking around during the day, cars are zooming by,
Mhm.
particularly later in the year if when they tend to be active, you know, dusk and dawn, and those times tend to overlap more with our commutes. We tend to see more animals hit by car, whereas areas where they're not habituated to people, they're less likely to be out walking around in a neighborhood or walking around where cars are at those times. And then also just the um, direct conflict with individual people and animals. Coyotes are a good example of that.
Mhm.
Bear are a really good example of that. If you're bringing them in and they're getting habituated to food, or they're getting conditioned to food, so think operant conditioning and Pavlov's dog and stuff like that. You know, that is a positive feedback loop. That's a positive reward. So they're going to keep coming back. And they're going to keep associating food potentially with the areas that they're getting food. And if they're getting food next to someone's house or in someone's backyard or next to a dog or next to a horse or whatever, they're going to be desensitized to those, what typically would be a negative stimulus for a wild animal. Wild animals should really be running away from people more often than not.
Right.
They should be coming towards us. And if they start getting conditioned to food, then that's one step closer to being habituated. And then once these animals are habituated, where they've kind of lost that fear of people, particularly for our coyotes and bears, that often ends up in the death of that wild animal, whether it's through hit by car or through depredation or a public safety action by one or more state agencies. Once an animal is deemed a public safety threat, and there's not many options for that animal.
And one thing up where I live, for example, I mean, you get these deer around here, and suddenly everything you plant in your yard is it's when we put in our front yard landscaping, we did some extensive homework on what is and is not deer proof plants, right? Let me tell you. So we planted nothing but deer proof plants, and the next day, about all of our deer proof plants were gone. I mean, so I don't know. Once you get them in here and they get it's like they can do a lot of property damage. They really can.
And that's one of the reasons why you might get a depredation permit on a bear, is because of property, or excuse me, on a deer, is because of property damage. Similar with a bear too. The other aspect of bringing animals closer to people is you also bring animals closer to diseases that are more of a domestic animal disease. So you think
Mm.
dog diseases, cat diseases, uh, potentially horse diseases, potentially, goat diseases, sheep diseases, cattle diseases that wouldn't normally be seen in a wild population. So they might be naive. And naivete is an important aspect of susceptibility. So if you're an adult animal and you've got your immune system kind of set, when you're a young animal, your immune system is constantly bombarded by new things, and you're kind of setting up your antibodies to deal with that stuff. As an older animal, and people who have kids, um, and people who don't have kids, who know people who have kids, who go to visit people who have kids, and then they get some nasty cold because their friend's kid has got it from school.
Right.
Um, you kind of see how that constant exposure can be a good thing for an immune system, but when you're exposed to those naive, or when you're naive and exposed to a new pathogen, um, then that can really set an animal up for bad news. And we certainly certainly been reported in things like mountain lions where there's a lot of overlap and with mountain lions and domestic cats, and something like a feline immunodeficiency virus, like the feline version of AIDS, kitty AIDS, um, found in mountain lions, but also feline leukemia virus found in mountain lions. Not something that we'd expect to be in wild animals, but because of that proximity, because of that overlap, um, those diseases are probably being transmitted from domestics to the wildlife. Um, Certainly see that with coyotes, and things like parvovirus and dogs.
Mhm.
Um, and there's probably will be more and more of those examples. I mean, COVID is probably the number one example. COVID's in deer, and it didn't, it jumped from us to deer. We don't know what that means, but there's, depending on where you're at, deer may be fairly well exposed to the virus, and it doesn't seem to be affected. They don't seem to be affected by the virus, but we don't know what that means for them in the long term, since it is a virus that likes to mutate, and we don't know what it means for us in the long term too.
I've heard that about, COVID going from humans to deer, which is certainly very interesting. Is the department doing any kind of studies on that, or is that kind of a wait and see type?
We're helping some other groups do some surveillance. We're doing some opportunistic surveillance ourselves.
Mhm.
Um, but really, I mean, the bottom line is we don't know at this point. We don't know what if any significance that there is with that.
Hmm.
Um, it's not a surprise. Uh, it might be a little bit of a surprise that it was picked up in deer, but it's not a surprise that we're seeing it in wildlife, just because we know that um, it's a pretty the virus has a pretty broad host range based on its makeup.
Out of concern for the damage that feeding wild animals can do, to wild animals and others, actually, California Department of Fish and Wildlife has a Keep Me Wild page on their website, right? What are some of the things that people can go there for that we didn't touch upon in this interview?
Yeah, a lot of the information there is excellent information on living with wildlife. Most of California is habitat to something,
Mhm.
and the more and more we get outside and enjoy our outdoor amenities, the more options we have to come in contact with wildlife. And the Keep Me Wild web page is on our department website, really sets a nice background on how to interact well with wildlife when you're out in the woods, and to keep our wild animals wild. And that's really the most important thing we can do is to facilitate that. And our webpage has a lot of that information, and it has various different species that you can dive into a little bit deeper on resources for living with, say, like coyotes or turkeys or mule deer or black bear, and sharing spaces outdoors, and safety tips for recreating outside, and other resources.
The easiest way to find that page would just, tap into your browser, California DFW Keep Me Wild, and I imagine it would just pop right up.
For bear specific information, there's an organization called Bearwise that provides a lot of good information on sharing space with bears.
And that's an interview that we'll be conducting with some other Department of Fish and Wildlife personnel here in the very, very near future to talk about bears, because they have become a serious problem here in California, and certainly up the road in the Tahoe region, where amazing number of bears up there that have gotten pretty good at living right there in town. So that, talk about human wildlife conflict, that's definitely an interview that we'll dive into. Another interview that I'm going to want to do with you, Dr. Monk, in the near future is chronic wasting disease. I know that you're the main player, the lead player for the Department of Fish and Wildlife on that topic. As a deer enthusiast and a deer hunter, I know what a serious issue that is. Most of the states back east, and it's slowly creeping its way this way. So I'm looking forward to having you on to talk about what things we can do here in California to keep CWD out of our borders.
Chronic wasting disease is the most significant disease affecting deer and elk in North America, and it's on every wildlife agency's radar. And preventing, mitigating, and managing that disease is a priority for most state wildlife agencies and federal wildlife agencies.
Brandon, a big issue right now is avian influenza. As a duck hunter, I mean, I've seen it firsthand out in the field. I mean, and read the stories about the impact it's having, on talking about wild animals transmitting something to domestic animals, coming from waterfowl to chickens, for example, and it's just devastated some of the chicken production throughout the United States. How does feeding wildlife play into something like that and perhaps make it much, much worse?
Yeah, so where there are semi-domestic waterfowl, or waterfowl that maybe usually should be migrating but aren't migrating because they have resources here where they didn't, decades past. Some goose species and some duck species. The feeding of those animals could keep them around longer, or could keep them residents year round potentially.
Mm-hmm.
And that could for a disease like high path avian influenza, where it tends to be maintained by the free range, the wild birds. If those birds aren't migrating, then the potential is that it's going to be around, and it wouldn't necessarily leave with a migration. And that may play out, and feeding of those animals might be a risk factor for it sticking around longer.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the first thing that I think of is Canada geese, right? I mean, when I was a kid, I mean, they were migratory, and now you've got these local flocks that never leave. And I know people that'll put on a lot of food for the Canada geese, whether it's a 5-year-old throwing breadcrumbs to them or whatever, they certainly get habituated to being fed as opposed to going out and finding their own food.
Mm-hmm. And it's how we alter our landscapes too. More watering of grasses and golf courses and stuff like that. It can provide a food source for animals such as that, and it's one of the reasons you migrate, is to find food.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that kind of brings us full circle a little bit, Bill, talking about how people feeding wildlife can change their behaviors. Once you start adding your own input of food into the environment in a place where it might not have been in the past, those animals that are really geared towards finding food can find it pretty quickly. And if we're changing that behavior, then a lot of things are going to start to change for that wild animal, and that is probably not going to be good for them.
Well, Dr. Munk, I got to thank you for your time today. I know how busy you are, and I think the information that you're helping to get out is certainly appreciated by me and others that care about wildlife, that actually think they're doing them a favor when they're not, right? So thank you for coming on, and thank you for answering some of those questions. Look forward to having you back sometime soon to talk about CWD, and we'll also get some department personnel in here to chat a little bit about the bear issue and the tremendous human wildlife conflicts that we're seeing in that arena as well.
Sounds good.
And thank you to our viewers for checking in with the Outdoor View today. That's the place where we educate, connect, and learn to protect our outdoor traditions. check us out on our website at www.theoutdoorview.org, our Facebook page, and on our YouTube channel.